Hello, welcome to the Breakaway USA show. I'm very excited, honored, privileged to have our guest, Mr. Bill Federer. We're going to talk about a number of things. I'm just going to pick his brain and see where we go from there about the US government and the state of where we are today in terms of compared to the founding, what the founding fathers intended and what we have today as a government. Welcome, Mr. Bill Federer.
Well, great to be with you.
Yes, sir. So I want to start by reading you a quote from the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but nonetheless, this is kind of the impetus behind my media channel, which is called The New Guards. So the line is, governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So this line in the Declaration of Independence, this is the impetus for them breaking away from the monarchy in England. My question is, did they provide a preface for us to acknowledge that our government is corrupt and do something about it in the sense of abolishing that government and restarting?
Yeah, so the majority of the Declaration of Independence are over 20 justifications for breaking away. The king has incited natives of the frontier to butcher the inhabitants. The king has waged war on the different port cities. One of them was the king was a part owner in the Royal African Company, and how he was making money off of slaves being brought from Africa to America. And that almost was included in the Declaration, but Georgia and South Carolina said no. But the idea behind the Declaration was to list all these reasons. And it basically goes back to a concept that rights come from a creator directly to each individual. And the government's job is to protect and guarantee to you your creator-given rights. This was different than in monarchies, where the king viewed himself as a lieutenant, as an intermediary between the creator and the people, and that he was the dispenser of the rights. So the Declaration more or less leaves out the intermediary and says the rights come directly from the creator to the people, and we choose our own leaders voluntarily, bottom up, versus a top-down form of government. But the last line, there's 4 mentions of God in the Declaration, and the last is appealing to the supreme judge of the world. So when you have a case and you lose it, you appeal it. If you lose it again, you appeal it. Well, you appeal to the highest court. Well, in America, that's the Supreme Court, but in England, it was to the king. But what if you don't get justice from the king? You go above his head and you appeal to the supreme judge of the world. And so that's what the founders did. That's why believing in God is necessary to our form of government. If there's no creator, rights come from the government, the social compact, right? The social contract, the group, the fraternity, the state, and what the state giveth, the state can taketh awayeth. So America's founders had to claim that they had rights from a source higher than the government, higher than the king, and the king was infringing on their creator-given rights.
So they decided to, commit an act of treason and draft this Declaration of Independence. And in signing it, right, they all could have been put to death. But so the impetus for this started with a tea tax, right? This is kind of one of the catalysts for it. The Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams, the Boston Tea Party. And so they had, I think it was like a 2% tax. But so this is what drove, the Revolutionary War. And if I'm correct, and really set the stage for the founding of a new country and a new experiment, a new form of government, of self-governance. Are we at a stage now where we should be issuing a new Declaration of Independence from our government. Is that's kind of what I'm trying to juggle with. Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I actually take it back a little further. One of my books called Who is the King in America? I go through every single century of recorded human history to see what the kind of government is, and it's kings. In other words, the default setting for human government is gangs, and a gang leader with enough weapons we call a king. And so you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and kings of Assyria, kings of Persia, kings of Babylon, kings of, the Elamites, and 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and Cyrus of Persia, and Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, and Attila the Hun, and 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, and Indian Maharajas, and Russian czars, and African chiefs. The norm is gangs and with kings. And it's a hierarchical system. If you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. It's a hierarchical structure. It's the norm. That's the default setting. And when the Reformation happened, you had large percentages of countries not believing the way the king did. And so the kings didn't like that. So King Philip II of Spain sent the Iron Duke of Alba to the Netherlands because they had been part of the Spanish Empire. And he committed the Spanish Fury in 1572 and killed 10,000 Dutch Reformed in Antwerp, Holland. Same year, 1572, the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, she had been ruling France through a young son because the husband died. And she decided 10% of France were Huguenots. They were Protestants, and she didn't like that. So she arranged a marriage between her daughter, Margaret, and the main Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre. Big wedding in Paris. A couple days after the wedding, she has her soldiers pull chains across the street, and the carriages could not go out of town. And she sends her men house to house. They kill 30,000 of these Huguenot leaders. It's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And so you had people protesting this, and they were nicknamed Protestants or Protestants. And one was John Calvin in Switzerland. And he said, "We are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against the Lord, let us not pay the least regard to it." And so it's this concept, sort of like Ephesians 6, children obey your parents. But what if there is a bad parent and he tells the kid to sell themselves into prostitution and kill the neighbor? Is the child supposed to obey that parent? No, the child obeys the parent as long as the parent's telling them to do something that lines up with God's word. You obey the government as long as the government's telling you to do something that lines up with God's word. Why would God tell you to do something in his word and then tell you to submit to a government that tells you not to do what he just got done telling you to do? And so this Calvinist Puritans, they came up with a covenant form of government. And they looked back to the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. So we talked about kings being the norm, but you have an anomaly. Around 1400 BC, millions of Israelites come out of Egypt. And for 400 years, there's no king. And it works because every single person is taught the law, and they're personally accountable to God to follow the law. And they're able to maintain order with no king. And it worked until the priests stopped teaching the law and every man did what was right in their own eyes. And it turns into chaos. And they all go to Samuel the prophet and they say, this self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And they get King Saul. Now, why is this important? Because the kings of Europe looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on part of the Bible, the divine right of kings. The Calvinist Puritans and the Baptists and the Congregationalists and the Quakers and the Presbyterians that founded America looked to the pre-King Saul period. This 400-year period, millions of people, no king, everybody taught the law, and everybody personally accountable to God to follow the law. Now, we talk about America, but actually, England had an American experiment for 15 years. It was called the English Commonwealth. So around 1640, you had Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, and they had a war, and they won, and they chopped off Charles I's head, and they set up this Commonwealth. It was a covenant form of government where they got to rule themselves without a king, and it worked until Oliver Cromwell died. His son Richard couldn't hold it together, and they bring back Charles II from France, and they reinstitute the monarchy. But it was, in a sense, a 15-year American experiment. We just got to continue it because there was a 3,000-mile ocean. And then France got in the war, and that caused Britain to have to spread its military around the world instead of focusing on one little colony to bring back into submission. So, but the intellectual foundation for America's covenant form of government, and the word federal is Latin for covenant, the intellectual background came from England, came from these Puritans and these Presbyterians and these Quakers and these people that were having a government without a king for that 15-year period.
So the split of church and state, this is something that a lot of people they praise as something that is good. You've spoken a lot about how the church has become very passive, very pacifist, especially during this whole COVID period. Nobody's speaking up or allowing. There's tacit acknowledgement of whatever the government was saying. Was this separation of church and state a good thing in your mind?
Well, the term has changed from the original meaning to the modern meaning. The original meaning was to keep the government out of the church, right? And so you have Roger Williams. He is a Puritan, but he's actually, you have doctrine and then you have church government. And so he was a Baptist, but he had emphasis on this congregational church government. The Pilgrims, by the way, the first Baptist church in England was founded by John Smith, not the Virginia Pocahontas John Smith, but another John Smith, John Merton and Thomas Helwise. And they founded the first Baptist church in England. Branching off of that church was John Robinson's church. And his church fled to Holland, and after 12 years fled to America, and we call them the Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims were basically a Baptist church split from the first Baptist church in England. But they had a congregational form of church government. It's a covenant form of government that requires everyone to agree to it and everyone to participate in it. And again, they drew this from ancient Israel, the first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. So we're talking the church government. Now, the King of England didn't like the congregational church government. He liked the hierarchical church government. It's a clergy laity model. The clergy does the ministry and the laity is lazy and watches them. And the hierarchical model, the king's at the top, followed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York and the deaneries and vicars and curates and rectors and priests. And your relationship with God is through this hierarchical structure. Well, the congregational church model is where the pastor helps everyone to have their direct relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ that died on the cross to pay for their sins. And then the pastor coaches each individual to learn to read the Bible for themselves, and then plug into the body and do something, because everything that's alive takes in and gives out. Every muscle to grow has to be exercised. For you to grow in your faith, you don't just hear a sermon and watch somebody else do ministry. You get filled full of the word and filled full of the Holy Spirit and put yourself in a position where there's a need, and then the Holy Spirit will flow through you to meet the need, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, and rescue those unjustly sentenced to death. And so the pastor saw his role as training the saints to do the work of the ministry. So this church model, these pilgrims, when they fled to Holland, then they fled to America, they originally were going to go to Virginia and submit to the king's government and just figure we'll be 3,000 miles away and he won't notice us doing our little pilgrim stuff. But they get blown off course and land in Massachusetts. They try sailing south, but off the coast of Cape Cod, it's really shallow. The sandbars and the shoals go out for half a mile and boats get stuck on them. And in a storm, the waves will beat the ship to pieces. 3,000 ships have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod. So the pilgrims almost sink, and the captain gets free, goes back to Plymouth Rock and says, it is too dangerous to do any more sailing, everyone off the boat. And these pilgrims say, well, who's going to be in charge? There's 102 of us in this boat, and nobody is appointed by the king to be in charge. They do something unique. They take their covenant church form of government and they make it their civil government. It's called the Mayflower Compact. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. And so this became the model for New England. So again, 1630, you have what's called the Great Puritan Migration. 20,000 Puritans flee England. And they estimate a fifth of the wealth of England fled. And they came to Massachusetts. Now, the ones that stayed in England had that Civil War I talked about, but this is prior to that. They flood in, and you have a unique situation where there's pastors and their churches founding cities. A pastor, John Lothrop, and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. A pastor, Roger Williams, and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island, and the First Baptist Church in America. A pastor, Thomas Hooker, and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut, and the First Congregationalist Church in America. This was unique on planet Earth. At a time when you had Chinese emperors, Japanese emperors, Indian Maharajas, Russian czars, Muslim sultans, African chieftains, kings of Spain, France, and Austria, the whole world is kings. And here you have this greenhouse where pastors and their churches are forming cities and coming up with the laws for the cities. And they're basically taking their covenant church government, everybody being involved, and they make it their city government. They had one building in town called the Meeting House, and that's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would gather together and do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law, and that's where they would gather together and do their city business. I mean, why build a separate building just to talk about a different topic? And so when the revolution starts, the British send over a military governor, Thomas Gage, and he outlaws meeting houses. Democracy is too prevalent in America. And the people, he says, you have to obey government mandates. And the people in America were like, no, we have a century under our belt of nothing happening unless we give our consent to it. And he's like, no, you obey government mandates. And we're like, no, nothing happens over here unless we give our consent to it. And he's like, no, you're a zombie. You're a robot. When the government says jump, you jump. You obey top-down government mandates. And we're like, no, nothing happens unless we give our consent to it. Turned into a revolution. And we won, and we set up a government where it's we the people. And it's the Declaration says, as government from the consent of the governed. It's a bottom-up form of government versus a top-down form of government. And they got their idea from the New England pastors who got it from the Reformation, who got it from the Bible, what part of the Bible, that first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul, called the Hebrew Republic. And so you not only were involved, you had to be involved. And so this is the 1600s. 1700s, you have the New Lights. So the Calvinists were called Old Lights.
Right.
Why? Because some of them said, well, you know what? God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, church, or government. Find out what the plan is, put it into place. And it got so plan focused that some said, well, you know what? God already knows who's going to be in heaven. So don't even bother preaching the gospel. Whatever's going to happen, happens. And it became dry and dead. And so
is it almost a form of nihilism?
Yeah, like fate, like in Islam, que sarah, whatever it will be, and God knows who's going to be there, so it's going to happen, and who can resist His will? So it's just going to happen. And so David Brainerd got expelled from Yale because he said his professor was as spiritual as a chair. Right? They're just teaching this academic plan, and then some Yale students got reprimanded because they were going into the town of New Haven and presenting the gospel to strangers in pubs. And that was considered disrespectful. You present the gospel in church wearing robes and being really formal. And so the 1700s, you have a movement called the Great Awakening Revival. And you had pietists that originally came from Germany. And they said, no, being a Christian is more than a plan. You have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change. And you won't do worldly things anymore. Like go to bars and brothels and lewd theater and get involved in government. Wait, what was that last thing? Yeah, government is filled full of worldly people. If you're really a Christian, you're going to be holy and you're not going to be involved in government. That's where the idea came from, where churches said, well, we're a little more spiritual than you are because we don't get involved in politics. We just preach the gospel. And it's like, where did that idea come from? Didn't come from the Calvinist Puritans of the 1600s. Why? Because everybody was involved. It came from the 1700s, these pietists. And so taking the part where they came from, 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation, and he had a personal experience with Jesus, a revelation that the just shall live by faith. So personal to him, he was willing to stand up to the most powerful man on earth, the King of Spain, Charles V, at the Diet of Worms, and say, unless you can prove me wrong from Scripture, here I stand, so help me God. It was extremely personal to Martin Luther. But some German princes have been waiting for a chance to break from Rome, and they go, this is it, kingdom of mine, I just decided you are all now Lutherans. And the people said, okay, what do we believe? So for the people in the kingdom, it's not the same personal experience Martin Luther had. It's just a new state doctrine. And so a revival movement starts called Pietism that said being a Christian is more than doctrine. Even if it's good doctrine, you have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change and you won't get involved in worldly things like bars and brothels and government. And there were even German princes that would donate money to the Pietists. So they would teach their people not to get involved in the prince's business.
So it's kind of an infiltration there. Like I see that as similar to what's happening here. There's a subversive infiltration that happened. Is that right?
Yeah. And so today you have George Soros and the Rockefeller Foundation, these groups funneling money to create a curriculum called After Party, where it's training church people not to be involved. Yet the left is training their people to get really involved. You have Rob Reiner, who was a Hollywood producer. He was on Archie Bunker. He was the character Meathead. And he did a movie coming out this month called God and Country. And it's trying to paint any Christian that wants to get involved as a boogeyman, as a Christian nationalist, right? And so they want to get Christians to not be involved, yet they want all the freedom to be involved that they can have. Now, Germany, this idea of if you're really a Christian, you're going to be holy and you're not going to be involved in worldly things. It turned into the German concept of the two kingdoms, the kingdom of the church, the kingdom of the government. The two don't touch. And 4 centuries of that teaching in Germany allowed Hitler to put Jews on train cars, and they're going past the church crying out for help. And the church's response was, well, that's the government doing that, and we're the church, and we can't get involved in that because that's their circle, and this is our circle. And so let's just sing praise songs to Jesus louder. Can anybody see there's something wrong with that picture? And so it actually, there is a middle of the road. It can be a personal relationship with Jesus and a covenant form of government where everybody's involved. And so the idea is that we want to have a personal relationship with Jesus, but wouldn't you want your children to have a chance to have a personal relationship with Jesus? Because if you don't get involved, what they are teaching the children is there is no God. And if he does exist, he's messed up. He's making mistakes. He's putting men in women's bodies, and you have to have operations to fix it. And I'm made in this guy's image. And he's either powerless or confused, or worse yet, he's sadistic. And if that behavior is not sin, what? Sex outside of marriage, right? They tell these kids, oh, here are all these books we're putting in the libraries and try any type of sex you want. Well, if sex outside of marriage is not sin, then arguably there are no sins. And if there's no sins, you certainly don't need a savior to save you from your sins. And so they're teaching an anti-Christ gospel. And so they're telling you, if you're really Christian, you'll sit back and do nothing while we teach your kids an anti-Christ gospel. You enjoy your own personal relationship all you want, but don't let your kids have a chance to have that personal relationship.
So that's something that the Soviet Union, Mao's China, they all understood that the church and the congregation and people meeting and talking and discussing was a threat to their top-down rule. So get rooting out the church is a very central tactic of all of these authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century. What I'd like to ask you is, so a comment on that actually is there's kind of a downward spiral. Once you start to accept one falsehood, one thing that is wrong, that is not true, then they just pile on. And one thing that sticks out for me is gay marriage. So I am open to, I'm perfectly fine with whatever anybody wants to do, but why appropriate the term marriage? Why was it necessary for them to take the word marriage? And when you like, why not have gay union or whatever? So that's one example of how you start with that and then you get to this trans stuff, right? It's one step at a time. And if you capitulate to people, especially leftists, they will just eat you up.
Yeah, I was reading an article, and it talked about how when President Obama was running for president, there was not one Democrat or Republican that was openly in favor of gay marriage.
Mm.
Not one. And when he was at Saddleback Church with Rick Warren, and he just gives his little talk, and he says, "Oh, marriage is above my pay grade. It's sacred. It's between a man and a woman, and I'm not going to get involved." And once he gets elected, he has a evolution of his views, and he not only is in favor of gay marriage, he uses the federal government to force it on everybody in the military. And if you don't go along with it, you're kicked out. And I've talked to dozens and dozens of officers and generals and colonels that were either kicked out or they took early retirement because all they needed was some underling to accuse them of not pushing it hard enough, and they could be dishonorably discharged and lose their retirement. And so they used what Obama said, "Oh, this is great. The gays can serve openly." Yeah. And if you don't go along with it, you're kicked out. It's called insubordination. And then he did it with all the federal offices, and then it did it in the schools and in the states, and boom. And then it goes from when they first presented it, it was gay marriage. It was, we don't want the government to tell us what to do in our bedroom. It's like, okay, you can do whatever you want in your bedroom, but as soon as it passes, they make a beeline for the preschool, and they begin indoctrinating little children, and then having their drag queen story hours. And then, and so if they would have been honest and said, "Okay, we want to vote because we want your children," nobody would have voted for it. But they said, "Well, we want to do whatever we want in our bedroom." It's like, okay, fine, do whatever you want. They didn't realize that they were going to immediately go after the children. And so, and then it went from LGB to LGBTQ.
Well, now it's just insanity, right? Now it's taken off.
And the irony is, you see all these women's activist groups suddenly disappear. It's like, here they were fighting for women's rights and women's rights, and remember, and now a man can just call himself a woman with no operations and just walk in there and beat everybody in competition. And where are these women's activist groups? They just folded, right?
Yeah. So all of these, so the LGB, first of all, is sexual. It refers to a sexual preference, right? It's lesbian, gay, bisexual. All the other things are just minorities, that minorities, and the gay movement, or sorry, the gay community, and it's not really a community, but the people that advocate for the gay community per se say this. They say that the trans movement is completely upending the gay movement, and exactly like the feminist movement as well. But so that transition from, just as this innocent thing, gay marriage, just taking that words are so important, right? The language and the word of God, is what is our conscience, is what has brought us up from the mud, But so a question actually that I'd like to ask you is, why was so we say Judeo-Christian values are what founded the West, and you explain it at great length. But why is Judeo-Christian Judaism and Christianity different than these other religions? And how does that emerge? How does what we have here, this idea of self-governance, emerge from Christianity as opposed to, let's say, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism?
One word: individual. So Judeo-Christian Western civilization highlights the individual, that you have a worth because you are made in the image of the Creator, and this Creator is not a respecter of persons. So everybody gets in rights that cannot be taken away, and everybody's equal. Every other belief system, structure, civilization is group-based. So you have in India the caste system, and 4 major castes and innumerable minor ones, and the top one is the Brahmin. And if you're born into that caste, you're near divinity in that Hindu belief system. But if you're born into the lowest caste, the Dalits, the untouchables, you have to clean the sewers. And even if you do a really good job at it, you cannot graduate in this life, right? You're stuck. There's no equality in that system. And then China, for centuries, they had the 100 family surnames. And if you're one of those names, you're a somebody. And if not, you're a Jajamin base people. And you're born into it. And then in Islam, they have the Ummah, the community. And if you're a Muslim male, you are worth more than a Muslim female. Muhammad said that it takes 2 women to testify in court against 1 man because a woman's mind is deficient. And then in Islam, Muhammad said that you can have 4 wives. A woman can't have 4 husbands. I don't know which woman would want 4 husbands, right? But there's not equality there. And then all the guy has to do to divorce his wife is say, I divorce you 3 times. The woman can't say, I divorce you to her husband 3 times and kick him out of the house and her get everything. And then infidels, for example, in Pakistan, a Christian, a non-Muslim has to hire a Muslim to represent them in court because a non-Muslim has no legal standing in court. And then a non-Muslim female is at the bottom, but you're born into it and you can't move up the ladder. All right. And then you have in communist countries, if you're a Communist Party member, you're worth more than somebody that's not a Communist Party member. Europe for centuries had a class system. And if you're born into the upper class, you're somebody. And if you're a peasant or you're worth nothing or less. You know, Beethoven was giving piano lessons to the daughter of a Czech duke, and they fell in love. But she was not allowed to marry him because she was the daughter of a duke, and he was a piano teacher. And so he wrote her some sonnets. But and Queen Elizabeth I of Spain, she was betrothed to marry somebody by the time she was 6. And then, you know, that guy died. And then she was betrothed to somebody else when she was 9. I mean, here she is going to be the queen, and she couldn't even decide who she was going to marry. Right. And so you look at what's developed and come to its fullest fruition in America is this idea that you have a worth simply because you are made in the image of the Creator, and His Creator is not a respecter of persons. And so this is, the individual. Now they're trying to reinstitute it, and they're calling it intersectionality. They're saying that your worth is dependent on how many groups you can belong to.
And how oppressed you are, what minority you are. Yep.
Yeah. And it's a group identity. And the founders rejected group identity. Now, when you get into group identity, it's socialism, and it's a tactic called critical theory. Karl Marx came up with the idea that if you want to overthrow a country and everything's fine, you're not going to do it. But if you observe the country and all the groups, and originally it was economic, and you'd have the proletariat versus the bourgeois, the working class versus the business owners. And you would organize them and get them to riot. And then in all the confusion, you could seize power. And so it came up with this term called dialectics. It's a triangle. You start off with the status quo. You go into a country and you find oppressed groups economically, religiously, racially, socially, and you call some victims, others oppressors, haves and have-nots. You stir them up against each other until there's violence and insecurity for life and property. And everybody says, government help. And the government says, we'll help. We just need to take away some of your freedoms to restore order. But individuals, so Western civilization is you as an individual have a worth because you're made in the image of the Creator. It's not the if you can contribute to society, you're worth more. If not, we pull the plug on you and let you die. No, it doesn't based on what you can contribute. It's based on you are made in the image of the Creator. It's an inalienable worth. Inalienable means that you can't give it away. You can't take it away. It's yours. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler, co-sovereign, co-king. So kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Democracies and republics have citizens. So in America, you get to be the king with the little k over your life, and all of us together are king with the little k over the country.
So I'd like to pivot a little bit and ask you about, so this is a quote by Thomas Jefferson. And so we have a constitutional form of government here, constitutional republic in the United States. Something that so this is the quote: I'm increasingly persuaded that the earth belongs exclusively to the living, and that one generation has no more right to bind another to its laws and judgments than one independent nation has the right to command another. This is something that I'm struggling with a little bit, because here is the author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding fathers and a contributor to the Constitution, and he's saying that there's no obligation for one generation to adhere to a constitution that a former generation instills. And it goes to this idea of a social contract and how it's not, it doesn't have authority over us unless we actually consent to it. And we're born into this system, and we're never, we're never asked about it. We're never consulted about whether or not we adhere to the Constitution. Do you have some kind of maybe clarification for me on that note?
So Jefferson primarily was talking about kings, and over again, he hated divine right of kings. He says, I don't believe that you had some people born to sit in the saddle and everybody else born to be crushed by him. And so he was talking about this system that had been in Europe and really the world for centuries, that you're born into these kings that claim to be divinely appointed and you can't challenge them. And so he was saying that we can throw that off and we can rule ourselves. Now, you did have, in the 1820s, Madison and Jefferson talked about that it would be okay for some states to want to secede. And that they, again, talked about, Jefferson made a quote about how power wants to concentrate. And if you get corrupt leaders in power, then every now and then, the tree of liberty needs to be watered with some bloodshed.
A lot of tyrants, yeah.
But one of the things I trace in a book called Socialism that I wrote, Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present, there's 4 stages. You go from the covenant form of government, which is what the Pilgrims and Puritans had. It's like a triangle. You get rights from God. You are fair to your neighbor because you're accountable to this God. Oh, there you go. Thank you. And you get blessings from God. You share them with your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. A century after the Pilgrims, you had the Age of Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, and Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion, and Newton discovering laws of gravity and laws of optics, and Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And you had some theologians that says, well, gee, maybe God made everything with laws and everything's just working like a guy makes a complicated clock and winds it up and he can go for a walk and it's still working. And it's like, yeah, God's the creator, but he's off in the distance and he's not really involved. So don't even bother praying. Things are just going to happen the way his laws are set up to happen. And so you go from the Pilgrims in covenant with a personal God to the Age of Enlightenment, a social contract with a distant God. And that's sort of around the period that the founders in America were. A century after that, you go from a social contract with a distant God to social contract with no God in the French Revolution. You get rights from the state, you're accountable to the state. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the father of the French Revolution, ideologically, he says, if the state says to an individual, it is expedient for the state that you should die, that individual ought to die because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. And so there's no God. And then the century after that, the French Revolution is Marxism, where the state is God. And Hegel, who taught Karl Marx at the University of Berlin, Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. The state is our mortal God. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. And so you go from these 4 stages: a covenant with a personal God, social contract with a distant God, social contract with no God, to the state is God. And, the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Sounds nice, doesn't work. Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism. It's the collective, the group, the state, the mob.
It's almost paradoxical, those words together.
Yeah, and then equality can be understood 2 ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff, equity.
Equity, yeah.
If the fraternity, the collective, the group thinks you individually have too much stuff, well, guess what? The benefit of the collective outweighs the benefit of the individual. And so they can use their collective power, crush your individual liberties, confiscate all your stuff, and redistribute it to all their friends and supporters, right? And even kill you. And so 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris. And then they sent their army to the Vendee, a rural area, and they killed 300,000 men, women, and children. It's considered the first modern genocide. And that became the model for every socialist revolution since. Kill off the old people that are sticks in the mud and won't do something new. And then we're going to do this new equality, liberty. But the people that are in power are human, and they are always going to be tempted to want to funnel a little extra to their family and friends on the side. And it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. So every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy passing out favors to their friends and then taking away from their political enemies.
So America is a federation, right? The ratification of the Constitution in of the new Constitution in 1781 was when when Washington started his first presidency under the new Constitution. Is that right?
Well, the Constitutional Convention started in 1787.
Yeah.
And then Washington was sworn in 1789.
89, yes. Okay. Not 91, sorry. So you had at the time anti-federalists, right? And you had the debate between federalists and anti-federalists. And the federalists were very much against the formation of a stronger federal government, a central government. I'm wondering if the anti-federalists had it right, because or I'm sure they were right on some points. And of course, the compromise was the 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. But this, Hamilton was in George Washington's ear a lot. And Hamilton, to me, is becoming more and more of a bit of a antagonist, and more of a somebody who did not have, had more of a monarchical or aristocratic perception of how the U.S. should be run. And then you had Shays' Rebellion, right? And from Shays' Rebellion, the Constitutional Convention came to be. What is your thoughts on that? Because the insane bureaucracy, the corruption we see today, would not have been possible if it was still a confederation. Where do you stand in terms of the anti-federalists?
Yeah, I think you got it right. I think the anti-federalists had a better understanding of human nature. So internal versus external, small government versus big government. The people that were concerned about external threats wanted a big government. And so you had George Washington and Alexander Hamilton that helped start the Navy. They were concerned about a reigniting of a war with England, and then the quasi-war with France. And also they wanted a strong currency. During the revolution, we had the continental, which is just paper money, sort of fiat, like we're doing today. And the countries of Europe were like, we don't want to send you stuff and have you give us these worthless continentals in exchange. So we're not going to send you anything. And so Hamilton was like, look, in order for us to have foreign trade, we have to have some kind of currency that's trustworthy. And so he helped start the treasury and everything. But then you had the people that wanted a weak central government because the abuses of King George III were fresh in their mind. And so, the revolution in 1770, the British controlled India. So they landed in 1714 and opened a trading port in Bengal that turned into a trading fort, that turned into them having guns. They would give guns to one kingdom, guns to another kingdom, and then stir up ancient animosities between them, sort of doing the critical race theory stuff. And then when they beat each other up, they would conquer both of the weakened kingdoms. And they did it again and again until they took over all of India. And so when they were in India, they saw these people that were doing their subsistence farming, and they said, okay, what are the cash crops? And let's sort of rearrange your economy around these cash crops. Well, they didn't understand monsoons and rains and periodic famines. Now, the people that were there, they would, understand this, and they'd always have some extra food stored away or whatever. Well, in 1770, there was a famine. And because of the disruption in their ancient economies, 10 million people died. And the British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And so they appealed to the King of England for a bailout. And the king says, okay, we're going to allow you to tax the people. But the people in England said, don't tax us. And so the king said, okay, you can tax the colonies and you can have a monopoly, and we're going to keep the Dutch and the French and the Spanish, other people, from bringing supplies in, and it has to go through you. And the big drink of the day was tea. And it cut out the middleman. So not just did they allow them to have a monopoly selling the tea, they would sell it directly to the people and cut out all these little shops. And so that was like a big business in Boston. And then they passed all these different acts. The Stamp Act, where every single piece of paper had to have a royal stamp on it. And Ben Franklin goes over to England and says, you guys don't understand, America is a rural country. The cost of having to collect this tax, I mean, on playing cards, on receipts, on marriage licenses, everything would have to have this stamp on it. And so they finally relented on that. And then they forbade the colonies to print their own currency. And then the king wanted to appoint all the judges. And you think, prior to then, the people in America would hire their own judges and pay their own judges, but the king insisted on paying the judges. And you think, oh, well, who cares who pays them? No, they understood that your loyalty goes with your paycheck. And once the judges were paid by the king, then and then they wanted to take somebody accused of a crime over to Europe for the trial, where it's not a jury of your peers. And so they began to institute these things slowly. And the colonists were like, we don't have a representative in Parliament. And if we're Englishmen, we need to have a representative in Parliament. And so they would say, they didn't have the representation. And then you had over in England, Edmund Burke. And he actually was in Parliament, and he was arguing in favor of the colonies. He said, that the Englishman is the worst person to tell other Englishmen that they should give up their rights. To send an English, general over there to say, we're going to, take away the rights that you should have. And so again, it was the centuries of this Reformation teaching that came from the intellectual bank of scholars in England, the Presbyterians and the Puritans and the Baptists and then the Quakers, that it was birthed over there, but it came into fruition over here. An interesting story is when the Reformation happened, the government decided that you could not make up your own prayers because you couldn't make up one that's wrong. So they wrote all the prayers down in the Book of Common Prayer. So you wanted to pray, you just open it to the right page and read the prayer. And if you're meeting with a small group, making up your own prayers, you're committing a crime. And the government will bust in your house, arrest you, drag you away to the Star Chamber. It's a room in the government that has stars on the ceiling, and it's sort of like a January 6th hearing room. And they would twist your arm and brand you on the face as a heretic and cut off your ear, and then stick you in a cell where you would waste away for days and weeks and years. And someone that was caught during this time was John Bunyan. Right? He had a Bible study, didn't get approval of the government. He spent 12 years in prison, and that's when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Well, in Scotland, they had their conventicles, their small group meetings, and the king didn't like that. And then in 1660, I think it was under Charles II, they brought up the Common Prayer Book for the first time, and they were reading it in St. Giles Cathedral. And a market woman named Jenny Geddes threw her three-legged stool and it whacked into the minister while he was reading the Book of Common Prayer. And then other people started throwing stuff, and it turned into this riot. And so the king sent his army, called the Bishop's War, to force all these churches to use the Book of Common Prayer. Well, the pastors were like, you know what? We got a way out. Let's just not meet in the church building. And so they would meet in fields and open air. Well, guess what? The government sent its army into the fields and hunted them down and killed them. It's called the killing time. And so this was the motivation that caused people to want to flee. And some fled to Holland. It was the 7 United Netherlands, and it was an 80-year war of independence from Spain. These 7 provinces didn't always get along, so they had some give and take when it came to religion. And so that's where the Pilgrims fled. And then the Pilgrims, fled to America. But again, they wanted to have in America what? Freedom of conscience. They didn't want the government mandating trans stuff or mandating, all kinds of stuff. It's like, do whatever you want, but don't force it on my kids.
Absolutely. And so you're talking about the First Amendment, of course, and freedom of speech being so vital to a healthy nation. Another quote by Thomas Jefferson: "The spirit of resistance to government is so valuable on certain occasions that I wish it to be kept alive always." Him talking about Shays' Rebellion in a letter to William Smith. He says, "Can history produce an instance of rebellion so honorably conducted? I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion?" And so this idea of rebellion against the government or resistance to the government, because it's understanding that the concentration of power will always slowly infringe on rights and then pull back, which is what happened throughout the pandemic. And one silver lining of the pandemic is that they had to play all their cards. They had to really, tighten their grip and show exactly what has been happening. This something that we call fifth generation warfare. I don't know if you've heard this term, where it's basically it's infiltration as opposed to external warfare. And people don't understand today what these atrocities that you're talking about. People with their grievances and saying that they're oppressed and whatnot. You go back 150, 200 years, they were slaughtering people for talking in fields, right? And this idea that people have today that they're oppressed is completely absurd. But it's something that it's not happenstance. It's something that is orchestrated, I believe. A question about so where we are today is the U.S. is America still a republic today? Would you say?
I mean, it's struggling. I did want to mention, why does this keep happening? It goes back to human nature and Cain killing Abel, and one king taking a kingdom from another king. St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. So you put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one's the diva, right? You put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others. You put some people in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief, put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. So the default setting is power concentrates into the hands of one person. And as the centuries go on and the weapons improve, you have somebody conquering a larger and larger area. And so that's the norm. Democracies where the people rule, Athens pioneered that for about 3 centuries. And from around 500 BC to 300 BC. And you had 6,000 citizens in Athens, and they would be called out of their homes to the marketplace. It started with King Solon, Solon, and he set up democracy, and then he left town. He's touring Egypt and Persia, and he left the people in charge. And it works, sort of good or bad, on and off, until one of the stories is Pericles. And he decided to move the treasury from an island of Delia. It's called the Delian League. Sort of like a bunch of these Greek city-states said, okay, we need money for our navies, but we don't want any one of these, so we'll have our money on this island. Well, Pericles moves the money to Athens, and then he borrows the money to build the Parthenon and this big port and this big navy. And the people start saying, wait a second, you're not acting like just another citizen, you're acting like a king. And when he realized that, all you need is the majority of 6,000 citizens to mark on a little piece of pottery to ostracize you, and you're kicked out of town for 10 years, and it destroys your career. And when they're talking of ostracizing him, he intentionally lets relations with Sparta deteriorate, so it turns into a war. And once there's a war, everybody wants a strong leader in time of war. So all the talk of ostracizing him is gone. Now, unfortunately for him, the Athenians were good on the sea, but the Spartans were good on land, and the Spartans forced all the people into Athens, and a disease broke out, and Pericles and his sons die, and Spartans rule for a short time, and then they're kicked out. But that set a pattern that whenever a leader in a republic is growing unpopular, he wants to get them into a war wants to fire some missiles into Bosnia, wants to do something to get the attention off of him onto something else. But a republic. So democracy, every citizen had to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. Totally time consuming. 40% of Athens were slaves because somebody had to do the work while they're talking about stuff. And if you missed a couple days, you're called an idiotus, an idiot, right? And since you physically had to be there every day, it could only grow as large as a city. So they call them city states. A republic is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day. They are your representative. So you're still in charge. You're just ruling through representatives. And so it's an easy way to remember the REP in republic is the same as the REP in representative. So a Republican form of government is a representative form of government. You're still the king. You're just ruling through a representative rather than a democracy where you physically had to be there. Now, democracies, since the people get the news and then the people make the decisions, it's an instantaneous thing. And you had Plato talking about an admiral fought a battle and he won, but in a storm, he didn't rescue all the sailors. And when he gets back, the people of Athens were so mad at him, they get whipped into this frenzy and they ordered that admiral killed. And Plato's like, this democracy it can be turned into a mob instantly. So he did not like that. Republics are a little slower to change because the people can be all upset, but then they get their representative and then they sort of go and it takes a little time and there's passions cool. Now, in America, we do a hybrid where we democratically elect our representatives. In Rome, the senators represented, but it was an hereditary position. So we don't have it hereditary. We democratically elect them. And it's a constitutional republic, which means these representatives are limited by a bunch of rules. They can't do whatever they want. They're limited. And the key thing is the Declaration of Independence gives the mission statement for the purpose of the existence of the country. And that's all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And to preserve these rights, governments are instituted among men. So a company, you have the purpose for the company existing, making pizzas or whatever. And then you have the bylaws of how they're going to run the company. Okay, who's going to be the president? Who's going to, make the deposits and everything. So in America, the purpose of it is to guarantee creator-given rights. And the Constitution is how we're going to achieve that. Okay, let's take the power. Let's break president every 4 years, senators every 6 years, Congress every 2 years, right? And the Constitution, in a sense, is taking the Tower of Babel and scattering it, taking this concentrated power of one person rule of a king and separating it into three branches, pitting them against each other, and then separating power federal to state level, and then tying it up with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. So the anti-federalists that you mentioned, they understood this magnetic pull that power wants to concentrate, this gravitational pull that's under the surface all the time. And they said we need to have more checks and balances. And it's in each of us. So let's say you're the king, right? Or somebody viewing, let's say you're the king and things are going along fine. And then you have a sister that you really love and she gets married, has a kid, and now the kid's a teenager and he's hanging around the wrong friends and he's partying and he driving home, he hits him home with a car and kills him. And now this teenager is facing manslaughter charges, prison time. And your sister comes begging to you. And she says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away, are you? What are you going to say to your own sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if somebody's family or friends with the king, they get special treatment, right? They're like, the Nancy Pelosi's husband gets insider information and so he can outperform everybody else on the stock market, right? You get benefits. If you're on the inside, and if you're not on the inside, you don't get it. It happens. And so the idea of the Constitution was to take the power of one person rule, separate it, federal, state level, separate it, three branches, tied up with 10 handcuffs. In other words, the Constitution is an attempt to prevent a president from ruling through mandates and executive orders to prevent one person rule.
So in 2020, and I'm not sure what your thoughts are on how the election took place. I have my own thoughts. We don't need to discuss that. But Texas and many other states, so Ken Paxton in Texas, he filed a lawsuit against it was Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, these states that seem to not abide by election and have election integrity essentially. And there was 15 other states that signed on to this lawsuit, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear it. I don't know if you remember this, but it was Justice Roberts, excuse me, that was the one deciding factor, and he decided not to hear this case. In this case, so two questions. One is, what other purpose does the Supreme Court exist for other than addressing grievances between states? Secondly, the idea of secession. Are we at a point where secession could be a good thing, and the fracturing or the breaking up of what is the American Federation, American Republic, or at least restructuring of it and reduction of this powerful central government? So secession, you said, was kind of built into the idea of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, or James Madison and Jefferson spoke about it. But is that something that is feasible today? What are your thoughts on the idea of secession and what that would mean for the future of America?
Yeah, according to address Roberts and the Supreme Court not hearing that, I think that was a failure on their part. And I think that the Supreme Court has become political, and you have appointments based on something other than people. Prior to Darwin, you had law, and they would go back and read the debates of the founding fathers to find out what the Constitution meant. And then Darwin comes up with his Origin of Species, Descent of Man, and a guy named Herbert Spencer wanted to apply evolution to everything else, including law. And so Christopher Columbus Langdell at Harvard University, it was the only university in the country that taught evolutionary law. It was called Case Precedent Theory of Law. In other words, instead of going back and reading the debates of the founding fathers, you just take the most recent case and bend it a little bit by broadening the definition of words. And so you have Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Harvard graduate, Supreme Court justice. He called it legal realism. And he comes up with all kinds of stuff where his biographer says that instead of the law being something that's given by God and an edict, now it's an ever-evolving thing, changing, but to the changing economic and social conditions of the country, and ever evolving. So you have two types of justices: the old-fashioned that want to go back and find out what the founders meant, and these new ones that want to have it evolve. And so unfortunately, the Supreme Court has too many people that think it can evolve. And I'm continually in awe that you could have someone like Ketanji Jackson, the first woman, right? First Black woman, and she cannot define a woman. And it's
we've reached a point of absurdity.
Yeah, it's like,
and it starts with that language of distorting language.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that the Supreme Court has become political, and I don't think it's beyond threats and intimidation and bribery. And we know there's threats because the left even protests in front of their houses. How can you interpret that as you got Chuck Schumer saying it's okay for them to protest in front of their houses? You can't interpret that any other way than it's intimidation. So that's
the left has no rules. The left has no morals. They have no rules, and that's one thing that's a downfall of conservatives is we try to play by the rules and we try to work within the system, but we're playing against an opponent that's rewriting the rules, that's reinterpreting the rules, that doesn't care about the rules. So there's an aspect of working from the outside and disregarding this corrupt establishment. There's something emerging called the parallel economy, parallel society. Have you heard of this?
Some, yes.
Okay. But so the idea of secession, sorry, just to wrap that up, to consider, this is a quote by Thomas Jefferson as well, to consider judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. I think we're at a stage where we have an oligarchy, or a technocracy, or definitely an idiocracy, but I don't think that we are, especially with the 17th Amendment, which we can talk about in a second. But I'd like your take on secession and what that would mean for America going forward.
Yeah, Patrick Henry's address as an anti-federalist, when he was arguing that Virginia not ratify the U.S. Constitution, he says, the problem I have with this Constitution is there's nothing to protect us from the tyranny of a king. He says it squints toward monarchy, and he says he says if there were the president's the head of the army, and who would want to challenge him? And he has at his disposal all of this. And he says, many states will disarm people, and he says we're basing this whole experiment on the chance that people will be good enough to pass laws to punish themselves. And he says, never in history has there been those that are armed willingly submit themselves to those that are unarmed. And so the secession does pose a problem. Texas is somewhat unique because it was its own nation for 10 years before it became a state. And it broke from Mexico, and with Sam Houston as its president, and then it became a state, I think in 1845. But so there is something unique about Texas. It does have access to the ocean. It does have oil. It does have many things that would allow it it's not landlocked and things. So, but nevertheless, if there were secession, it would be the perfect time to be attacked from without. Inside, outside. You look at ancient Israel. They come back from Babylon. They have their country, and you have Ezra, and he's teaching the law, and he starts the Pharisees, and they're students of the law. And then Alexander the Great comes, conquers Persia, and the Greeks conquer the Holy Land, and they get one of his generals, Seleucid, to control the Jerusalem area. And so there were Jews that wanted to kiss up to the Greeks, and they were called Sadducees. And they viewed anything spiritual as sort of backwards. They didn't believe in resurrection and miracles and angels, and they would go to the Greek, bathhouses and the naked statues and all that kind of stuff. And so you had Sadducees and Pharisees, and they actually had a civil war. They actually were killing each other. And this was going on when Pompey, the Roman general, was up in Cappadocia and Armenia, in the Eastern Europe area, and he's conquering some kingdom, and they bring him word. There's a civil war going on in Israel. And Pompey says, great time to invade. And he comes down, and the Pharisees are helping him against the Sadducees, and the Sadducees control the Temple Mount, and Pompey conquers it, and he goes in and he sees the inside of the temple, and he tells his men, don't touch it, leave it alone. But from that point on, Israel was a province of Rome. And so the situation is, yes, if we have an internal division, there's a good chance that would be a perfect time for China to not only take Taiwan, but you look at history with China over the last decade or so, they would go into third world countries and say, you have rare earth metals, you have something that we want. And the little country would say, no, these are ours. These are for our people. China would bribe the politicians of the countries. And they would vote to let them come in. And they'll sure enough put in highways, but they'll take all the rare earth metals or whatever and export them. And so they have the China Silk Road Initiative, and they go to all these little countries and say, we're going to build a highway through your country. And they're like, well, we don't want to. It says, okay, we're going to bribe the politicians. And if somebody doesn't want to get bribed, they might have an unfortunate accident. Who knows? And but this bribe or the bullet, silver or the lead, and so they're basically
Are you
doing.
talking about, sorry, are you talking about modern China? Because there was also an older Silk Road initiative, right?
Right. Well, the China Silk Road was a trail that was on camels and donkeys, and it went all the way from China across northern India into Turkey for the spices, and they had raiders called the thugs, and they would attack and kill. And then when the British took over India, they finally eradicated the thugs that were ambushing these caravans. But that was just over dirt. So the current Silk Road Initiative is actually to build a major highway across all of those Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkestan, all these countries, and it'd be economically tying all these countries together. But the model that I was highlighting was that the Chinese method of diplomacy is the bribe or the bullet, and so they've. From all appearances, it looks like they've been doing that in America with Hunter Biden, and you have even McConnell, and the Feinstein's driver for years was a Chinese person, and then one of those congressmen, the name escapes me, but his girlfriend was a Chinese spy.
Fartwell.
Yeah,
sorry, Swalwell, but sorry, go ahead.
But you can't, we're talking global power, and as concentrated as it becomes in America and in Washington, D.C., it would be naive to think that people that want power would not be tempted to want to come in. And then they have the honeypots, which anybody that does a little digging, and that's where they will invite congressmen to parties and maybe drug them up and maybe have with compromising situations, and then the next day they sober up, go to work, and there's a brown envelope on their desk with all these pictures, and they said, if you vote the way we want, nobody will see these. And so from that time on, that is what's called compromised. And so when you have a lot of these politicians that they ran and they gave good speeches, and then they're not voting the way that you want, there's a good, and then they started the House Ethics Committee. Sounds nice, but all it was started by Nancy Pelosi. All it is Democrats digging up dirt on Republicans. It's like opposition research, but it's a continual opposition research. And you wonder why some of these really good congressmen suddenly decide they're not going to come for reelection. And then they come to you and they say, okay, we have this stuff, and maybe it's not bad at all, but if they leak it, it will be negative press, and that will hurt you and your family, and so they opt to not run for reelection. So it is a
Mr. Federer, are you saying that Epstein didn't kill himself?
Yeah, I think that the fact that they still will not release the list of who was on his planes, I think it's because a lot of people that are still in power don't want that list to come out. I think it's the same reason why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Is saying that the CIA was involved in killing his uncle and his dad. And supposedly, and Tucker Carlson had the interview where they said Nixon wanted to release all that information about the Kennedy stuff. And that's when the Watergate thing happened. And like 4 of the 5 people that were in Watergate were like connected with the FBI. And so it looked like it was an entrapment type thing. But why? Because there are probably still some people that were involved in those different activities, and they don't want that to come to the light of day.
I'm almost sure of that. To talk about the CIA and Kennedy, so he wanted to destroy the CIA. He has a famous speech where he says secrecy is the antithesis of a free society, and I want to scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And now you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy talking about abolishing the FBI, gutting the FBI. These institutions, initially were created to fight against external threats, but now more and more, it seems like they're just a tool for oligarchs to subjugate us and control continue to control the country and hang on to their power. Can I ask you a question then that aligns with this? Is the founding fathers. So the founding fathers hated democracy. There's endless. There's a bunch of quotes of them saying that democracy is the devil's own government. But this is pure democracy, right? They thought democracy was mob rule. But so, like you said, there are democratic principles that are part of our government, part of the way we elect our representatives. But so, like you said, we have a mixed form of government. So from what I understand, the executive branch is kind of represents monarchy. You have the Senate, which is kind of represents aristocracy, and then the House, which represents the people, the common people. And these were all elected differently. You have the electoral college for the executive branch. You have popular vote for the House, which is the democracy, and then for the Senate, you had a different form of electing or choosing the senators from the states. You have two senators of each state. It was the state legislatures that chose the senators. Is that correct?
Yes. And when they went to DC, their goal was to keep the federal government small.
Yeah.
Because they had to report back to their states, and the states wanted to keep the state power.
Mm-hmm.
And so in, I think it was in the early 1900s, they had this.
It was 1913, the 17th Amendment.
Thank you. And so you had the Rockefellers and the J. Paul Gettys and these very wealthy people. They were pushing to change. Why? Because to run a statewide race, you need money. To run for a state rep seat, it's very inexpensive, and you can just shake a bunch of hands. But to run for a Senate seat statewide, you need a lot of money. So you either need to be a millionaire or go to the millionaires and sell yourself. And so from the 17th Amendment on, as you mentioned, the Senate represents the aristocracy, the wealthy people. And if they don't go in as millionaires, they certainly come out as millionaires.
Right. And so the senators prior to the 17th Amendment were chosen. They were appointed by the state legislatures. And so the state legislatures essentially chose people that, I think Benjamin Franklin said, people that made themselves adequately known in society. So people that are well-to-do people, or people that are influential, people that are wise. And so they were chosen and elected, I guess, within each state legislature. And then following that, now you have popularly elected Senate. So we're almost at a full democracy. Only the Electoral College stands, and the left wants to get rid of the Electoral College. And if we get rid of the Electoral College, we're a democracy. We're no longer a republic, right? But so the Kennedy, one of his quotes actually is that in Profiles in Courage is that with the 17th Amendment, we essentially lost the Senate. And the Senate is no longer representative of the states' rights or the state's interests. It is now representative of corporate interests and special interests. And so this we're seeing the repercussions of this. The Senate is extremely corrupt. So another note on that is something that you told me when we met at AmFest, is that the House of Representatives, it used to be 30,000. It used to every House member was represented 30,000 people, and then at a certain point, it got limited by the number of seats in the actual Capitol building, the House
in 1911
House chamber.
In 1911, with the Reapportionment Act with Taft.
Can you explain that a bit? Yeah.
So in 1857, they redesigned the U.S. House chamber, and the architect only put in 435 seats. He could have put in 530, 635, but only put in 435. At the time, there was maybe 130 congressmen, and then after the Civil War, where slaves could be counted as were freed and could be counted as a full person, then it went up to 180, then 280, and then but finally by 1911 they reached 435. When I think Arizona or New Mexico came in, they put a couple seats in the aisle, and then I think in 1920s they did it again. So they said, okay, instead of one congressman for every 30,000 people, we'll just take a census every 10 years, take the population of the country, divide it by 435. And so maybe one congressman representing 70,000 or 100. Now it's one congressman representing 700,000 people. There's no way you can shake that many hands. So when Lincoln ran for Congress, he was like going to a farmer, and the farmer said, "If you plow a row in my field, I'll vote for you." And he got out and plowed a row of the field. All you needed was the 30,000 votes. That's like shaking 7 hands a day for 2 years. You can shake that many hands. You can't shake 700,000. So it turns running for Congress into getting money. And even if everybody knows you and likes you, the other side can do a smear campaign called an October surprise, where the week before the election, they release some smear like, "Did you know that he fooled around years and years ago?" And everybody be like, "No," and then they don't vote for him. And then a week after the election, they found out that it was all a lie, but it's too late. You lost. And so if you don't have money and buy airtime ahead of time, because even if they smear you and you have the money, you can't buy the airtime to answer it. And an accusation left unanswered is considered to be true. And so it turns running for Congress into having lots of money, which means that the congressmen have to go and sell themselves. In the Bible, it's called taking a bribe. I mean, you can't take money from somebody and not expect you to feel favorable toward that person. And so our situation is that's a default. But originally, since it was just 30,000 people, you could get a reputation without needing a lot of money. And so both the Senate and the House. And then we see illegal immigration coming in. And when they do the census every 10 years, they don't ask if you're a citizen. So if the population of, let's say, California goes up, they have, I think, 52 congressmen, if I'm not mistaken.
I did not know this factor. Okay, interesting.
So if the population goes up, they're counted in the census. And so when they apportion the congressmen, those areas will get more congressmen. And then they'll have more congressmen in the House to be able to sway the votes. And the electoral votes are divided by the number of congressional seats in the state plus the 2 senators. And so the state will get more electoral votes if they increase their population, even if they're not citizens.
And I'm sure that they saw how effective the mail-in ballot scheme was in 2020. I'm sure they're going to try to print mail-in ballots for all of these. They're actually trying to make it, they're actually trying to pass a bill to allow illegal immigrants to vote. But so this goes to
But by the way, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was in Texas last week speaking, and the lady that ran is Grassroots America was the name of the organization. She said that when you get your driver's license, you automatically get a voter card. The motor voter federal law that was pushed through, I think, in 1994. And there, she said on the form, there's a little box that you check for citizen. And she said, "I have asked everybody in the Texas government, does anybody check to verify that if they check the citizenship box, that they actually are a citizen?" And she said, nobody in any government position checks to see if somebody checks citizen, if they really are a citizen. And she said, it's just the honor system. So they get their driver's license, they check the citizen box, they're a citizen, right?
And this is in Texas.
Yeah. And so
imagine what's happening in other states.
So they can go in and vote, and nobody asks them with the polling place, are you a citizen? And if they do ask if you're a citizen, they don't require you to bring a birth certificate or anything. So they're letting them all in, and there's no system set up to check to see if they vote, if they're a citizen or not a citizen. So yes, they're coming in. Long and short of it, they're going to turn into voters.
So to me, it's clear that if the 2024 election is legitimate, there's no chance that Biden gets elected. And Trump is clearly, that's if it's legitimate. So clearly these people like George Soros, who's said in an interview that Trump is an existential threat to the world, there's no way they're just going to roll over and allow that to happen without doing something dramatic. And I know they've played a lot of their cards, but I'm worried to see about what they're going to do next. But so you are familiar with Ken Paxton and the 2020 election and how he stopped the sending out of mass mail-in ballots and essentially stopped Texas from turning blue. which was being spoken about at the time. But Ken Paxton is not discussed enough on the right or in general. He really is a very important voice and fighter in America right now as the AG of Texas. And you see how much they've gone after him and tried to remove him. And they've done this October surprise, I guess, but and tried to create scandals and, impeach him and whatnot. Thank God it's not worked. Backtracking to the House of Representatives. So if there were to be 70,000, if each House member were to represent 70,000 people, we would have to have, if my math is correct, 10,000 people, 10,000.
Yeah, and I've been
to 5,000 if it was 70,000, and about 10,000 if it's 30,000.
Yeah, so there's 300 million people in America, roughly.
Yeah,
and so if it's one congressman for every 30,000 votes, that would be 10,000 congressmen. Mm-hmm. I've been to 4 Republican national conventions as an alternate delegate and so forth, and 10,000 people show up, and they get their business done. They break into all their committees, and then they come together to hear a speech. So anybody that does polling knows that the larger the sample size is, the more accurate it is. And so if the goal is for the congressman to represent the country, the more that you have, it's going to be a bigger, more accurate representation of what the people want. And then anybody that knows politics knows it's harder to twist 10,000 arms than 435. And really, if you got half of them already on your side and you just need a few more, it's really a small number of arms that need to be twisted.
It's very feasible. It's a very feasible alternative. And
And so you can still have the Capitol building for ceremonial things. And if you want to get everybody together for a big speech, you can, rent a basketball stadium in DC. But the idea is that it's the people that we want to have represented. And so I think that would be a thing to put on the table again.
Well, I 100% agree that and essentially amending the 17th Amendment and removing the 17th Amendment. If we can get to that, then we would actually get back to the way America was supposed to be run, because the question between anti-federalists and federalists and the ratification of the Constitution, and is the Constitution actually a sufficient enough and powerful enough document to help us preserve liberty into perpetuity? The thing is that it's been altered and perverted, right? So did you have something to say? Or
one other thing, winner take all. So
the Electoral College, you're saying?
Yes, it used to be one electoral vote per congressional district, and then plus the 2 senators. Mm-hmm. And Aaron Burr, who was Jefferson's vice president, and then when Jefferson ran for re-election, Aaron Burr ran back then. The person that got the most votes was the president, and the person that got the second most votes was the vice president. Well, Jefferson was running for re-election, and he was tied with Aaron Burr. And everybody assumed that Jefferson would be the president and Aaron Burr would be the vice president. I mean, that's the way it was before. But Aaron Burr waited to concede that and started doing things behind the scenes to see if he could get somebody to flip. And Alexander Hamilton, who did not like Jefferson that much, but he did not like Aaron Burr more, he got some electoral votes to flip toward Jefferson. Aaron Burr was so upset, he challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel and killed him. And then Aaron Burr was more or less banished and so forth. But Aaron Burr had pushed through in New York the winner take all. So the New York legislature voted, because each state could decide how they were going to do their elections within their state. And so the state of New York voted that whoever won the majority of the popular vote would get all the electoral votes. And so that he did that in New York. Jefferson followed that in Virginia, and then every state followed it except Nebraska.
Did they have the constitutional authority to do that?
Yeah, the Constitution says that the states get to decide how they want to do their voting. And so some states, would have ballots. Other states, in Kentucky, they would have elections where you would just, it'd be like a carnival, and you would get up there and you'd swear, and then you would say out loud who you were voting for, and they would mark it down.
We should go back to that. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, and then of course, then you had the Democrats in the South that were doing their lynchings, and so you would carry your ballot as a piece of paper and drop it, and they were frisking the black people. And if the black people were going to vote Republican, they would lynch them and intimidate them. And so the idea was to have the names pre-printed on the ballot, so you wouldn't have to carry a piece of paper with you. But then the states would start having requirements to have your name on the ballot, right? You got to get your name to us ahead of time, and then you have to have so many signatures, and then you have to have, and they would make it, the hoops would keep it getting bigger until now. It's almost impossible to start a third party.
But the founding fathers, John Adams has a quote, I believe, where he says one of the worst things that could happen is if America turned into two great parties, and that's it, right?
Yeah, there's Washington's farewell address. He called it the spirit of faction. And he says that it taps into the most deepest human emotions, and it facilitates foreign interference. And so at the time you had France, but the idea was that France would come to one party and say, we'll help you against the other. I was like, oh, really? Thanks for your help. But they would expect favors back in return. And so it said, in this way, the will of one country will become the will of another, because this faction would cause such heated hatred between the two that they'd lose the picture. This is sort of how Islam took over. When Muhammad went into Mecca, or Medina rather, for the first time, there were 3 Jewish tribes that never got along. And Muhammad picked on one of the Jewish tribes, confiscated their property, chased them out of town. The other 2 tribes said, well, as long as he's leaving us alone, we're fine. They'd keep their heads low. Then Muhammad picked on the second Jewish tribe, confiscated their property, chased them out of town. And the big tribe kept their heads down and said, well, maybe you won't know. Finally, there's one tribe left, and Muhammad cut off their heads. If he would have come in and said, in 5 years, there's not going to be a Jew left, these tribes would have made up with each other. So it's the divide and conquer. They did this in Spain. There were all these Visigothic kingdoms that never got along. And the Muslims would come in and conquer one and conquer, and the other ones would sort of stand back until finally they were all, driven out. And then they had 700 years to do the Reconquista to drive them out. But this divide and conquer, today it's called critical race theory. So you go into a country, you divide it into groups, and you pit the groups against each other, and you weaken it. And then you can conquer it easier. Jesus said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. It's sort of like introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease? It's where your own immune system starts attacking your own organs. You got a war going on the inside of you, it weakens you, and then you can get conquered. And so how do you destroy a marriage? Sow division. How do you destroy a church? Sow division. How do you destroy a country? Sow division. And so the critical race theory is sowing division.
And that emerged from cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism, I believe. So Khrushchev, I think it was Khrushchev in the 70s, said that America will fall without us ever firing a shot. And this is the idea: is the long march through the institutions and the decay from within, and we'll destroy ourselves. And we see it manifesting in kids and parents destroying themselves, mutilating themselves.
Yeah.
It's absurd. So do you have to go?
Probably pretty soon.
Yeah. Sorry, I can keep you forever. I told you that. Last question. I guess the 2020 election. So I'd like to get your take on this, and then we can wrap up. But so 2020 election, the states. So during the whole COVID nonsense, you had the executive branches of each state and the judiciaries of each state changing state laws, the election laws. But the authority is actually in the state legislature to decide how the election is chosen. You remember when the state legislatures then issued a new slate of electors and sent them to Washington? I wonder I'm curious what your take is on that and the constitutionality of that, because then they were gaslit into, the 2020 election was and the media coverage of it was the biggest gaslighting operation I've ever seen, and very effective. And then January 6th, obviously. But what is your take on the constitutionality of the slate of electors that was sent by the state legislatures?
Yeah, there was what I believe orchestrated fraud and they needed a crisis to cover for it.
Mhm.
I ran for Congress 3 times, in 98, 2000, 2004. And 2 of those times was against Richard Gephardt. He was the House Minority Leader. He was the Nancy Pelosi before Nancy Pelosi. He was the most powerful Democrat in the U.S. Congress. And on the day of the election, we got calls to our office that my name was accidentally left off the ballot in 5 wards in the city of St. Louis. People went in to vote for me. My name wasn't there. And so we made some calls, and they said, okay, tell you what, we'll just tell all the polling places to stay open till 10 o'clock and then midnight downtown. We'll just tell everybody to come back and vote again. It's like, how are you going to know who voted and who didn't? It's because confused. It was a planned confusion. The next time around, they left people's names off the registered voter list. And so somebody named Robert D. Odom went in to vote, and his name was not on the registered voter list. And rather than fill out a provisional ballot, he went down and filed a lawsuit. And the judge says, okay, we're going to keep the polls open until 10 o'clock and then midnight downtown. It's like, same thing 2 years in a row. And so we drive downtown, and there's people lined up around the streets, and they're all looking happy, like they got paid. And he wins. And the next day we find out that Robert D. Odom had died 2 years earlier. We're like, who brought the lawsuit then? Well, somebody in the Democrat Party, and it went from front page to back page till it was forgotten. They literally did the fraud, and they got in. And then the third time I ran, I stood all day in front of Guffey Elementary School, shaking thousands of hands. It was the biggest precinct in the county. That night, we're at our watch party, and I'm watching the TV, and the phone rings, and it's our volunteer. And she said, I'm down here checking off all the precincts, and they can't find the box of ballots from Guffey Elementary School. It's like, that's where I stood all day long in the cold. And I said, who's in charge? Oh, some 80-year-old lady. She went home 2 hours ago. Who else is in charge? And we make a big stink. Finally, they got somebody to go to the basement. They find the box of ballots. They bring it up. And the law says every box of ballots is supposed to be in full view of a Democrat and Republican election judge till it's counted. And everybody sees this one. And while this confusion is going on, my opponent announced he won. And I mean, so when you spend 2 years of your life 3 different times, and on election night, there is some confusion, it gets it pretty clear that this was not an accident. This was a planned accident, that they needed somebody and some excuse for this irregularity that they could slip in. And so when I saw what happened in 2020, I saw all the telltale signs that this was a planned emergency. And like Pennsylvania, only the legislature can change the election procedures. And you have an unelected person changing it on the spur of the moment. And then that case goes to the Supreme Court. And even Amy Coney Barrett, right? I mean, we're all happy that she got on. And then all of a sudden she decides, I'm going to recuse myself. And all these people are like, I'm not going to. It's like, you're good for nothing. It's like, hello. The state law says only the legislature can change it. Here's an unelected person that changes it. You need to get involved. They're like, oh, we don't want to get involved. I mean, it was, and then you have pictures in Georgia of them pulling suitcases out from underneath.
That video is absurd.
And then, I mean, we could go on and on about this. But
yeah, we can maybe talk about it another time.
Anyone that has any curiosity knows that something was not right.
Just the amount of ballots cast, from 2016 to 2020, there was an increase of 30 million ballots cast. That's absurd. And so last comment on that, and I'll let you go, is that essentially the media is so powerful today that it almost chooses who becomes president, because if the media announces that somebody is elected, it is very hard to then backtrack, and it's a very uphill battle, right? So it's the same way that your opponent declared that he won without the election even being done, it's very hard to go back on that. Can I actually, sorry, very, very short question on taxes. Before, there was a period where there was no income taxes, right? Is there a way of backtracking our tax system and getting to that?
That would be untying the Gordian knot. But yet you're right. There were no income taxes in America till the Civil War. Lincoln pushed it through as an emergency. After the Civil War, it was repealed. No income tax till 1894. They tried pushing one through, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in the case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust. Any legislation that discriminates based on race, religion, or economic status is class legislation, leads to abuses. And then you had Taft pushing through a corporate income tax. And then you had Woodrow Wilson pushing through the income tax. And it was originally a 1% tax on the top 1% richest people in the country. And so the people in America thought it was just going to tax the Rockefellers and Carnegies and J. Paul Gettys, basically the Bezos, Zuckerberg, Soros, Warren Buffett. It wasn't going to tax us. And then World War I started. Woodrow Wilson said, okay, we had an income tax during the emergency of the Civil War. Now here's another emergency, so we're going to keep it after the war. It was reduced, not repealed. And then FDR comes along, another emergency, World War II. He ups it to astronomical levels and expands it, not just the 1%, but to everybody. And then he institutes paycheck withholding. And that started something called outsourcing. So businesses and people said, hey, well, how do we get away from this tax? Let's move our factories overseas. And so then it created globalists that were loyal to their financial bottom line, no longer loyal to a country. And that's what we're struggling with today.
Yeah, we're in a weird period. Mr. Federer, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been looking forward to this. I have a million, hopefully we can talk again at some point when you have some time. Pardon?
I'd be happy to talk anytime you want.
Okay, awesome. I'd like to maybe finish off on this quote by John Adams, which is, our Constitution was made for a moral people and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And that's kind of a recipe for getting back to a state, in my opinion, of self-governance. Is we need to reinstantiate moral values that are just these truisms, right? But anyways, thank you so much for coming on again, and we'll talk soon.
Well, one on that Adams quote,
yeah,
our government was designed to govern a people who could govern themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the more internal restraints the populace had, the less external restraints they needed. And but I do want to end with this last thought, that every generation has a crisis. And the crisis is an opportunity for people to rise up. What are the stories we love best? Like in the Bible, Moses, David, Gideon. It's when God's people are in hopeless situations, and you have little nobodies who are small in their own eyes, but big in faith and courage, to step forward and say, God, use me. And God turns things around. And this is just our turn. And whether it's a George Washington with a ragtag army against the most powerful military in the world, whether it's, Lincoln, slavery, whatever the crisis is, this is just our turn. And so I think it's an exciting time. I sometimes think, well, someday you'll be dead and you'll be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And you'll meet Moses and Gideon and David, and they'll tell all their exciting stories of standing up to evil and having courage. And then they'll all look at you. So you tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be down there on earth? What were they saying about God and your country? And what did you do? And I'd hate for any of us, to be up there and squirm in the seat, right? So this is our turn to do those great things that you'll be known for forever.
We're truly at war with force and with forces that we haven't even understood till now. So your work, your wealth of knowledge is incredible, and I've likened you to Jordan Peterson when we spoke, and I think that you two are kind of two sides of so he's, I guess, more psychological and you're more historical and philosophical, and I think you're such an important voice. So thank you so much for your work, and yeah, we're in a fight, and we need to stand up. Sir, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and again, I'm happy to be on with you anytime.
Awesome. Okay, take care.